We all sat down near the fireplace as Grandpa rested his back on the armchair holding a glass of wine. Every winter, my sister and I come to visit him. My grandpa is a retired Army general who now lives in these hills owning a small tea garden. I love coming here to relax my mind from the hustle and bustle of city life. My sister Amy lives in Montreal, so she too loves spending some family time here. After our parents died in a car accident, Grandpa is the only family we have. Apart from all these reasons, visiting Grandpa carried a particular purpose. Amy and I both enjoyed hearing about his life experience. His days in the Army were filled with terrifying incidents. Until today, they gave us goosebumps just by hearing from Grandpa's mouth. Also, he had this amazing ability to narrate those experiences in such a picturesque manner that it left us stunned and speechless at the end. We have heard many incidents, and each stands out to be unique in its own way, except this one that we heard last winter. Picking up from where I began, Amy was sitting opposite of Grandpa, and I was standing in front of the window watching the snowflakes floating in the air. The house was warm, and the dim lights created a perfect environment for a scary story. Amy took a sip from her hot chocolate and said, "You never told us a horror story, though."
"You mean stories of seeing ghosts? Do you believe in ghosts, darling?"
"I don't, but do you?" Grandpa smiled and looked at me. I said in a firm voice, "I don't believe in ghosts either." I noticed Grandpa getting aloof, as if some memory carried back to his mind. No one spoke for 5 seconds, and all we could hear was the sound of the wood burning in flame. Staring at the trembling fire, Grandpa exhaled a deep breath and said,
"Well, I can't assure you about the existence of ghosts, because when this happened, I was going through a traumatic phase mentally. So, some can say it was my imagination, but somewhere deep down, it felt so real to me."
"Please tell us, Grandpa. It will be perfect for tonight," I said excitedly. Grandpa starts the story.
"Back then, I was posted in a small village in Utah that was being evacuated overnight due to an already speculated attack. We all expected the enemy to strike in the morning, but they started to destroy our base camps right before dawn. On that chilly winter night, we did all we could do to resist their unexpected attack, but many soldiers got injured and many died on the field. I was shot in the arm and would have bled to death on the battlefield if not for my fellow soldiers who saved me and took me to the Army hospital. The Army hospital was old and has been there since World War II. Due to the serious injury, I was shifted to the emergency care ward with all other injured soldiers battling for life. Though the daytime went by somehow, the nights were tough to spend in that hospital. The constant smell of medicines and chemicals hit me hard after dark. 2 nurses used to be assigned for each ward, holding 50 to 60 soldiers per emergency ward. Some of them had massive injuries like 80% burn wounds or shot in the head but still survived somehow. Some had to be amputated to stop their entire body from going to a septic shock. Screams and cries echoed in the hospital hallway as these injured soldiers withered in pain. I still remember this one soldier who was admitted to the next bed beside me. He lost half his face in an explosion and still managed to survive. He slept all day with heavy sedatives, but sometimes at night, he woke up screaming in pain every time the nurses dressed his wound. The nurse shed tears while removing the blood-soaked gauze from his face. Chunks of flesh came off every time fresh wounds received touch. That day, I felt war is much more about suffering and torture than glory and pride. Anyways, I mostly spent the day in bed even though I was perfectly able to walk. The doctor prescribed complete bed rest after taking out the bullet, so I had to follow his instructions. The hospital often suffered power cuts at night. Now in the middle of a war, this was hardly an issue to complain about. Every patient in the emergency ward had urinals attached along the bed, so they don't have to get up, and most of them weren't in that condition to do so. But I, on the other hand, was quite better health-wise. So, after a point peeing in a urinal bag while lying on the bed, started to feel a little uncomfortable for me. The washroom was on the end of the corridor across the lot, and I knew the nurses won't let me walk there at night. But one night, I felt the urge to pee and decided to do it like a man. I got up on the bed and looked around. The entire emergency ward was lined up with beds on both sides. Candles were placed in the corner to give light. I saw one nurse dozing on a chair nearby and the other going for her rounds. I thought, this is the ideal situation. Before the nurse returns, I can easily go and come back to bed after finishing my business. Also, not walking for a long time started to hurt my legs. I got down from the bed supporting my arm at the saline stead and stood on the ground. A sense of relief blossomed in my mind. Slowly and steadily, I walked to the nearest corner and picked up a candle to lead my way in the dark. Because the corridors had no light, each nurse carried a candle to make her way during the rounds. I came out of the room and found a vast empty corridor standing ahead of me. The pale moonlight came from the high-rise glass window and created a shadowy effect throughout. I started walking holding the candle gently. The hospital is so big that if I lose the light, I can easily lose my way here. As I left behind the emergency ward, I stepped into a world of darkness and dead silence. The subdued chirping of the crickets outside was the only thing I could hear at that point. I was walking on my own when I suddenly realized someone is following me. I stopped and turned around, but there was no one in that enormous corridor except me. I thought it was all my imagination, so I shrugged it off and started to walk again. But after a few seconds, that same feeling of being followed started to bother me. No matter how many times I stopped and turned back, I didn't see anyone. When I was almost near the washroom, I heard a painful cry. It was as if someone is whimpering in pain. I know the second emergency ward is upstairs, and I have to come far away from mine. So hearing sounds from that ward is almost impossible for me. I said in a firm voice, "Who is it?" No reply came, and the cry just grew louder. Suddenly, it started to come close to me. I raised my candle in the air, trying to look if someone is coming towards me. Whoever was crying came near me and stopped all of a sudden. Standing in that dark corridor with nothing but trembling candlelight, I felt an unknown fear. I said in a scared voice, "Who are you? Do you need any help?" No reply came, and the cry just grew louder. It started to come close to me. I raised my candle in the air. A rough, painful voice spoke.
I can't see."
I thought maybe a soldier got lost in the dark, and obviously he lost his vision, so he is trying to find his way back to the emergency ward. I said in a fumbled voice, You can come with me. I can take you back to bed. Here, holds my hand." I stretched my hands toward the darkness in front of me so that the blind soldier can reach out. I waited, staring at the pitch black corridor. I could hear my own breathing as I waited for this man to find his way in the dark. A second went by. 5 seconds went by. But still, there was no sign of him. I was about to walk ahead to look for him when I heard running footsteps rushing towards me. A hand came up from the dark trying to grab my hand, and I was almost going to hold it when the owner of the hand appeared in the light as well. I screamed in horror as a disfigured body stood in front of me. The soldier is not blind. The part of his head over his lips was cut off. Blood and flesh was hanging from this vicious wound. The lips moved one last time and said,
"I can't see."
I fainted on the floor right then and there. When I woke up, the sunlight from the window fell on my face. A nurse and doctor stood right next to me and discussing something with a serious face. The doctor gave me a strict warning not to leave my bed. They said they found me unconscious near the washroom after hearing my scream. As long as I stay there, I never left that room, be it night or daytime. The day I finally recovered and got discharged, I asked the nurse about a soldier coming here missing more than half his head, to which she replied, "Many people died here, and it's impossible to keep track of their injuries. But there is a saying in this hospital, that those who died a painful death still roam the corridors at night. The souls of these dead soldiers still try to find their way back to life without realizing they have died long ago."
Hey guys, I see many of you commenting on my videos that this channel deserves 1 million subscribers. But I also see the percent of people who watch my videos aren't actually subscribed to the channel. So, if you like the content, want to support my channel, and want to see this channel reach 1 million subscribers, or maybe 500,000 subscribers, then go ahead, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. It's free, and you can always change your mind later.
Before I begin, I would like to say that what you're about to hear is not an experience of mine, as it happened to a man called Alexei Ivan, my grandfather. And this is a recollection of what he told me and my brother one fateful afternoon. I remember I was 17 at the time, and me and my little brother, who was 16 at the time, were bickering about something. I remember I blurted out, "I hate you, Tom," and my grandfather, who was sitting on the couch, then turned to me and sternly said, "Don't you ever say that, boy. If you only knew what you have." I remember being confused, and I asked, "What are you talking about, Grandpa?" And that's when he sat me and my brother down and he said, "Let me tell you a story of how my little brother saved my life." He started the story by telling us about the time during World War II when he and his little brother, Andrei Ivan, were soldiers during the Siege of Leningrad. It was on the 12th of October, 1941, and we had been surrounded by the Germans for about a month. The Germans had taken the city me and my little brother lived in. We didn't know it at the time, but Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was just about to enter true hell for the next 2 years. Now we knew Hitler was trying to starve us out, and it didn't fully hit us until the 3rd month. Our parents were dead, and it was just us both and our little sister. We were both drafted as soldiers, so we asked an old female friend to take care of our little sister. We knew since we were soldiers, we weren't always going to be with her. For the first 6 months, we watched things get from bad to worse as things weren't letting up. The German soldiers were still holding up the South, and the Finnish military, who were under the Germans, had blocked the North. There was no way out. Me and my brother were moved to the trenches since we were part of the Soviet soldiers. We stayed in the trenches for weeks. The weeks seemed like months, and it didn't take long before we were knee-deep in corpses. Starvation set in, and soon enough, death looked like a far better solution than what we were going through. But even through all this, I took solace in the fact that I had my little brother Andrei with me through it all. I remember him telling me, "We are Ivans. Even hell isn't enough to take us down." I laughed at what he said and we cheered. But come winter, we'd know something worse than hell. November 1941 was the beginning of something worse than hell for the citizens of Leningrad, as winter had arrived, and with it, a different kind of suffering came too. Communication had been cut off, and food was reduced to crumbs of bread per day. For us soldiers, we had to find a way to survive. So we began to eat anything we could find, from birds to lizards. We ate anything we could get our hands on. Our group had gotten a bit bigger as we met and made some other friends during our time in the trench. Their names were Anton, Boris, Czeslaw, and Dima. We were making our way across the trench when we saw a man and his 2 sons eating meat. Something was odd, as it was impossible to see meat in this city as we were closed off. And at that moment, meat seemed like a thing of myth. As they saw us, they began to run and hide, and that's when Anton raised his gun and said, "They're cannibals!" Instinctively, we all raised our guns. We had been recently receiving reports of cannibalism, and we were told to bring those who we caught. We later found out that the man had killed his wife and fed her body parts to his 2 sons for food. We were told to shoot him down, as that was the punishment for cannibals who killed and ate people. As the months passed by, rats and birds were getting hard to find, and the cases of cannibalism were reaching the thousands. I once came across a child eating the corpse of his dead father. The government had classified the ongoing cannibalism cases into 2, the person-eating cannibals and the corpse-eating cannibals. The cannibals who ate people were to be put to death, and the ones who ate corpses were to be thrown in prison. The numbers continued to rise as the siege carried out, and when it was nearing the 2nd year, madness had engulfed the whole city. Me and my brother managed to stay sane by eating any bugs, roots, or flowers we could find. It had been 2 months since we'd seen our friends as we were sent far down the trench. Eventually, we started making our way back to regroup, and I remember my brother Andrei was looking extremely sick. I remember him saying, "I don't feel too good, brother," as we walked and made our way back to the familiar base in the trenches. I remember telling him, "Be strong, Andrei. We are Ivans. We'll find the others and regroup, and by doing that, we will have strength in numbers." It took us 2 days to get over there, but we made it. The place was desolate and empty, but we were hearing sounds coming from inside the base. I remember calling out to our friends. Anton, Boris, Cheslav, Dima? We were answered with nothing but silence. That's when I heard my little brother say, "They aren't here, Alexei. I think the only solution we have now is to lie down and die." Hearing my brother give up was the most painful thing to hear, and as I was about to leave, 4 things attacked me. They looked like humans, but their skins were gray and their eyes were bloodshot. They immediately began to sink their teeth into my skin. I reached for my gun, but it was knocked out of my hand. I felt their teeth dig deep into my skin as they started to tear off my flesh. I fell to the floor, and I had to accept my fate. But that's when my little brother began to pull them off me. He began to fight them off, and he gave me a chance to escape. As I stood to my feet, I could feel myself bleeding as I had lost a lot of blood. I wanted to help him fight, but I had lost my strength. I stood there transfixed, and that's when I heard my little brother Andrei scream, "Run, Alexei! I can't leave you!" I replied as I braced myself to fight. As my brother struggled, he then began to shout, "So what do you want for both of us to die here? I need you to live, Alexei. You need to live for our little sister Irina, and you need to live for me. You've taken care of me throughout my life, and it's my turn to return the favor. Run, brother, run!" But before he finished his last sentence, I saw one of his attackers bite down on his neck. As he struggled to speak, he began to lose his footing, and as he fell down, I watched them tear my little brother apart. The pain of watching him die was less than the pain of letting him down. So I picked up my gun, and as they were tearing his corpse apart, I began to shoot and kill each and every one of them. After a while, all that was left was silence. As I began to dig a grave with my own 2 hands, and I buried what remained of my little brother's corpse. I cried deeply as I stayed there mourning. After a while, I composed myself, and I decided to fulfill my purpose to him, and I swore to live. I looked at the things that had attacked and killed my brother, and as I recognized them, a horrific realization dawned on me. The men who laid on the floor were our friends Boris, Cheslav, Dima, and Anton. I couldn't recognize them before as they looked completely different. Their skin had changed color and their eyes were bloodshot red. But as their corpses calmly laid on the floor, I could make out their faces. The pain was too much as I considered these men brothers too. But the siege had driven them mad and they had long passed their sanity. The pain was too much for my heart, but I pushed on. I had managed to survive the remaining year, and I pushed on through another 5 months. I will never forget the day the siege was lifted as I cried in honor of my brother. I immediately went back to the city, and when I got there, I found out my sister, Irina, was dead. Through the remaining years, my life gradually began to lose meaning. And as I was about to give up, one of my cousins called, and she said she heard what happened. She said that she was moving to the United States and asked if I wanted to come with her and start afresh. I hesitated, but I remembered the promise I made to my little brother, so I decided to live. I moved here and I met your grandmother about 3 years later. Eventually, we gave birth to a wonderful little girl who grew up to be your mother. My grandpa then looked directly at us and said, "See you boys, cherish each other because our time on this earth isn't guaranteed. And the only reason I'm alive today is because I decided to live for my brother. So you both should live for each other too." My grandfather Alexei Ivan died about 2 months after he told me and my brother this story. And I decided to share the same story to everyone who's hearing this. It's in memory of the greatest grandfather who ever lived, and I'm glad to know that wherever he is happily reunited with his brother Andrei and his sister Irina. Alexei Ivan, 1914 to 2007. It happened in her French hometown on the Western Front during World War II. A unit of German soldiers had come to lay siege to it after steamrolling through every other town on their way. The town managed to resist thanks to the uneven terrain and abundant trees that made tanks ineffective. The attacking Germans had to rely on relatively small artillery instead, though that didn't make things any easier for the defenders. For one, these German soldiers weren't your typical Nazi. They weren't the infamous Waffen-SS. But a few defenders who were veterans of the previous World War could tell that they were a cut above the average cannon fodder. For some reason, they would only focus their attack efforts at night. They shot at the town with guns and light artillery under the cover of darkness from seemingly all directions, leaving the defenders confused and terrified of where the next shot might come from. Those manning the town walls fought half-blind against every attack, unable to spot their enemies in the darkness, save for the brief muzzle flashes of rifles and artillery. The best they could do was try to guess where the enemy were by the sound of their gunshots and shoot back, hoping they'll hit something other than trees. It wasn't a very effective tactic, but it helped hold the attackers back at the cost of blood. After every night, wounded defenders would be sent into an old building that had been converted into a makeshift medical ward. There, my grandmother and other volunteer nurses would patch up their wounds as best they could with what was available. The soldiers under my grandmother's care would often tell stories to pass the time and get their minds off the pain caused by their lackluster medical care. They spoke of one man in the attacking German unit, an officer of some sort, who always wore his black dress uniform more fitting for a parade than actual combat. No medals decorated his breast, yet he held an imposing presence that left no question as to who was in charge. He had the eyes of a predator that almost looked like they shone in the dark, and he somehow knew the forest like the back of his hand, commanding his troops through the thicket without issue. The town defenders jokingly started to call him Monsieur Loup, Mr. Wolf in French, because of his fine clothes and apparent mastery of the wilderness. They had no idea how fitting that name was for him. Naturally, being an officer dressed as flashy as he was, Monsieur Loup became a prime target for the defending snipers. However, none of them were ever able to hit him. The split second he heard a gunshot directed at him, he would duck or cover just in time with inhuman reflexes. Meanwhile, the defenders were dropping left and right. Most of the injuries sustained in the siege were actually what you'd expect. Gunshot from long-range rifles, shrapnel wound from artillery bombs, and the occasional broken bone or concussion. Aside from casualties in battle, the soldiers also died in the medical ward from infection or blood loss. However, some were met with a much more gruesome fate. There were nights when the enemy would not emerge from the forest or discharge a single shot. Sometimes, the night would pass without incident, but there were also times when defending soldiers, usually those assigned to isolated patrols, would be found dead the next morning with no sign of the murderer. Their throats and bodies had been torn apart as if some wild animal had ravaged them. The few witnesses were driven mad by what they saw. According to them, a terrible beast killed their comrades before disappearing into the night. Their doctors determined it to be a form of hysteria, a delusion made up by shell-shocked men who refused to believe that a human being, even an enemy, would be capable of such brutality. However, my grandmother found out firsthand that the stories told by those soldiers were all too true. One night, the enemies attacked in the middle of a thunderstorm, allowing one of the defenders to do the impossible. He shot Monsieur Loup. A young private named Gabriel had managed the feat by syncing the sound of gunshot with the thunder. For a whole minute, he had his rifle scope trained on Monsieur Loup's chest and waited for lightning to signal incoming thunder. The moment the thunderclap finally came, he pulled the trigger. Unable to hear the gunshot coming his way, Monsieur Loup got struck by the bullet square in the chest. The attackers immediately stopped firing and made a hasty retreat back into the woods with their wounded commander. Just before they disappeared back into the forest, Monsieur Loup himself shot his pistol back at the town walls one last time. The bullet hit Private Gabriel in the shoulder, and he was carried away by his comrades as the hero of the day. Over the following days, Gabriel's shoulder became infected, and she got closer to him during that time. Enough so that he confided in her about the death of his wife at the hands of the Nazi. He still wore their silver wedding ring in remembrance of her. They kept in touch after he recovered enough to fight again, and on one full moon night, my grandmother went to visit him at the town wall. It was one of those quiet nights where the enemy wasn't attacking. Everyone knew that it could mean someone would be found dead the next morning, but tried their best not to think about it. It wasn't like there was much they could do anyways. My grandmother ascended the town walls, knowing that Gabriel was on duty that night.
She wanted to give him some pastries that his admirers in town made for him and check on his injury again for good measure. She found him standing guard over the edge of the wall, and they greeted each other as friends. She handed him the goods, and they struck up a conversation to pass the lonely night. Just as they were about to say their goodbyes, the sound of scratching stones drew their attention. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere below outside. Curious, my grandmother stayed there as Gabriel looked over the town wall to see what it was. The moment he peered his head over the side, a humongous hand reached out from under the wall to grab his throat. Though it shared the shape of a man's hand, it was covered in coarse black fur and tipped with claws that dug into the flesh of Gabriel's neck. My grandmother watched in horror as the thing attached to that hand clawed its way to the top of the wall without releasing its grip on Gabriel's throat. Although it stood on two legs like a man, it was covered in black fur with a snarling wolf-like head and a healed-over bullet wound on its chest. Though it looked like a beast, the hatred in its yellow eyes was too human as it slowly strangled the helpless private with one hand. Gabriel tried fighting back, punching the beast in the face over and over again to no effect. Just before another punch could harmlessly connect, the beast opened its jaws and bit down on Gabriel's left hand. There was the sound of crunching bones, followed by the gnashing of meat as the beast swallowed Gabriel's hand, and with it, the silver wedding ring. The beast suddenly let go of Gabriel after eating its hand. It made a pained, choking sound before letting out a bone-chilling howl that drew the attention of everyone in town. The beast scratched at its own throat as it stumbled backwards. It fell outside the walls and landed on the ground with a thunderous thud. My grandmother quickly got to work patching up Gabriel's hand using a strip from her own dress as a tourniquet. By the time she managed to staunch the bleeding, every soldier and half of the townfolk had flocked to the walls to see what had caused the howl. My grandmother pointed them to the other side of the wall where the beast fell. But instead of the nightmarish beast that had just bitten off Gabriel's hand, lying on the dirt below was the naked body of Monsieur Lou. He still had the wound from where Gabriel had shot him, and his face was twisted into a look of sheer shock and panic with veins bulging around his throat. The town siege didn't last much longer after that incident. People assumed that the attackers must have lost their nerve after the death of their commanding officer. However, some soldiers reported seeing something strange during the full moon nights. Sightings of a giant wolf with a missing paw tearing apart the German attackers under the light of the full moon. Private Gabriel continued to live in the town, though he was taken off military duty. My grandmother soon left the town to continue being a nurse in a different part of the front, so she never found out what became of him either. I don't know if there's any truth behind her story or not. It's an entertaining story, if nothing else. And now that I'm a soldier myself, I can't help but to wonder if I'll ever get to see something like that too.